Good morning, everyone. Hopefully you're having a beautiful start to the day. I wanted to reach out again today to just explain a few things that I'm been explaining to a few others. So on the back of our superannuation post yesterday, we got a few comments from people essentially saying that they don't believe in superannuation and that they believe superannuation is not right and it's a rout and this, that and the other. And I have to admit, I kind of don't get it. Superannuation is an ownership vehicle. Essentially, it was designed in the 90s to help individuals retire. So, let's just explain this a little bit. So, the government essentially tells employers to pay a percentage of your salary into an account that is invested. Now, the way that it's invested is, in most funds, totally your choice. You could put it in cash, you could put it in shares, you could put it in a blend of both, you could put it in property if you have the right structure in place or the right options in place. So it's your choice on the way that you can invest your money. So if you had your money in a bank account and you had it all owned by yourself, you could invest that the way that you want to as well too. You could invest it in property, you could invest it in cash, you could invest it in bonds, whatever you wanted to do. So superannuation though has one big advantage and a disadvantage as well. The disadvantage is, unless you meet a condition of release, you can't receive that money. So, unless you're totally and permanently disabled, or if you've retired, or there's certain conditions that you've got, and obviously recently one of the conditions has been COVID impact, you can't touch that money. But there's tax concessions that are given, Any money that's earned inside superannuation is capped at 15%. And if you had that in your personal name, it could be taxed at 46.5%. Once you hit pension age and start taking out, for example, an allocated pension, those earnings are tax-free. Whereas if it was in your ordinary name, you'd be getting taxed at potentially the highest marginal tax rate. So, the government says for locking your money away until you retire, we'll give you tax concessions. So, in accumulation phase, 15%. In pension phase, 0%. So, investments are very similar. Tax concessions are different. But it is usually a better tax situation to have money inside super, with the disadvantage of it being locked away. So the other thing we were getting as well too was not just that they don't believe in it, but, my parents didn't do it, they don't believe in it, and just put all our money in property. Okay. I'm going to tell you straight from the start that I like property, okay? As much as I like stocks, as much as I like other assets. So I'm not against property. And for the right people and for the right person, property is good. But we need to understand the environment that most 20, 30-year-old people's, 40-year-old people's parents walk through. Now, I'm going to use my parents' generation. They're in their 60s. So, they bought their first house in the western suburbs of Melbourne in around the late 70s. And, houses around in the western suburbs were anywhere between, say, $50,000, $60,000, $70,000. Now, first of all, people say to me, oh yeah, but incomes weren't that high either. Yeah, they weren't. They were probably, the purchase price was, let's say $50,000. At that point in time, they were earning, let's say, about $15,000. Okay, so right now, the average house in Melbourne, I think, is about $650,000, with the average income being around $60,000 or $65,000. So we're looking at a difference between, when they bought around, 4 to 5 times the amount, and now you're looking at about 9 to 10 times the amount of income. They say back in the day, oh yeah, but it was hard for them and interest rates were at 18 to 20%. And that's right. Interest rates were at 18 to 20%. So let's just understand this though. Back then, there wasn't much lending. So when you went to go buy a house, if the bank lended you money, they would only use one person's income. So let's say for argument's sake, back then, we're not talking now is different. There was a husband and a wife, and they would walk into the bank and they would ask to get a loan. The bank would say, thank you, Mr. and Mrs. Smith, but we're only going to use Mr. Smith's income, not Mrs. Smith's income, because we know that, you're young, you're potentially going to have children, so we're not going to use her income. Now, don't get me wrong, different now, but that's what the banking scenario was like back then. They only used to use the primary person's income to service the loan. Therefore, purchasing of these properties were harder from a lending perspective. So what that essentially meant is that property prices were relatively cheap. So what changed? Why did from the late 70s to now did property prices skyrocket? Okay, so a few things. So immigration. So you got to think 60s, 70s, mass immigration, especially in regards to the Maltese, Italian, Greeks, Macedonians, all of that kind of coming through. You then had the 80s, and you had a lot of Vietnamese and stuff like that coming through as well. Also, we had then later through the 80s and 90s, you also had the Croatians and the Serbians and the Macedonians as well to come through, and the Bosnians. So you've had this mass immigration, and we've now lately seen that as well too coming through and continuing to come through. So with immigration becomes demand for property. So obviously it's a supply and demand thing. The more that the demand is there, the more the properties have to be available and more people willing to buy. So that's one aspect. But I think the biggest aspect in regards to property, and people need to be aware of this, is the lending game changed. They started using two people's income. They started using rental income. They started using whatever income they did, and the regulation in regards to the lending framework really loosened up. So if think about it like this. You've got, back in the day, one person only able to get a loan. They may have been able to maximum spend $100,000 on a property. But as soon as you add a secondary person on that, their lending ability, they could have borrowed $200,000. So when you multiply that with mass immigration into Australia, it stimulated a demand that we have never seen before. And if you look at the graph on the property demand, it is exponential. Okay. Now, coupled with the fact that interest rates continued to decrease. Okay. And now we are at record low interest rates. There is going to be continued demand that the RBA is trying to stimulate. Okay. So why am I talking so deep about history in regards to what's going on? Is I think because people need to understand property prices increased for a reason. And that's okay. It's not to say that property is bad once again, but just to be aware that there's contributing factors to why money has been made in property over years and years and years and years and years in time. So immigration, loosening of lending requirements and lending needs, and I think overall the increase in income as well. So when I go to hear people that say, hey, superannuation's rot, I just want to kind of pull it out and put it into a property, for example, I think you need to understand that how superannuation is invested, it's your choice. You can choose how you want to. If you've got the right structures in place, you can invest the way you want to. You can invest in property assets, you can invest in stocks, you can invest in cash, you can invest it the way you want to. If you pull it out and put it into a property in your ordinary name, just remember all you're doing is really changing the structure in which it's owned by. And I highly recommend that you engage with a financial advisor and your accountant to make sure that the assets are owned the right way. Ownership structures are really, really important. Every client we see, we make sure we ask, how's this being owned? Have you spoken to your accountant in regards to the right appropriate tax structures? Have you engaged with a lawyer in regards to making sure that the property or whatever investment they were doing is owned the right way? That is key. So I think my last point that I want to make is, if parents are saying, hey, we don't believe in superannuation, so you shouldn't believe in superannuation, I question their knowledge about superannuation. I question, has their personal experience in the society that they've grown up in impacts that push of that superannuation is bad? And remember, the hardest thing to break is genes. It's the way that they thought. It doesn't necessarily need to be the way that you think, but it is the hardest thing to break, and I acknowledge that. So guys, I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you enjoyed these videos. Please leave some comments below. I would like to know. Give me any feedback, any topics you would like me to discuss. And I think the gist of the story is, hey guys, superannuation is not bad. I think education in regards to the way that it can be utilized is very important. And pulling out money out of superannuation because it is a poor investment, you just need to understand it a little bit more. Okay? And reach out if you want to know. Okay? Have a lovely day. Keep well. Remember, none of this advice is personal, and this does not take your situation into consideration. This is general advice, so please don't act on this. Go see a financial advisor, go see an accountant, and yeah, have a great day. I hope you enjoy. Keep well.